Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's jointly hosted webinar by myself, Samantha Manning of Searches UK. And today we're kindly joined by Emma Baddeley of Estatesearch. Please can I double check that everyone can hear me? If you can, please do use the chat and the questions tab just to let me know. Also, just to let you know that during the webinar, if you have any questions or you'd like any further information, please do use the chat and the questions tab, and myself and Emma will be able to answer any questions you may have after today's session. Just to let you know, we will also give out our contact details, so if you would like to contact us at a later date, you can do so. And today's session will be recorded. But for now, let me hand over to Emma and I'll speak to you all soon.
Thanks, Sam. Yes, good morning, everyone. It's lovely to join you today. I'm coming to you from Bedfordshire, where I've just actually moved house. So, and I will just say that it's a new house, it's a new build. So there are actually huge JCB diggers trundling past still because there's lots of buildings very close to here that are not finished yet. So I don't think you'll hear them, but if you do hear a massive rumble, don't worry, it's not a jet landing on the house. It's a huge big yellow JCB digger. But yeah, hopefully we won't have too much interruption. So as Sam said, I'm joining you today to talk about managing shares in estate administration and the common challenges that face solicitors when looking at that area within an estate. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Strategic Relationship Director at Estatesearch, and I work with partners such as Searches UK to deliver products through their portal. So everything that we're talking about here today, all the share services, and indeed other products like the Estatesearch and other things that you're used to, purchasing as part of the estate administration process, is all available through your Searches UK portal to order. But Sam can come on to that later. Sam will also be following the webinar up with lots of information as well, and we will be sending out the slide deck. So don't worry too much if you missed something or you have a colleague that wanted to join. So let's have a look at what we're going to be talking about this morning. So really for Estatesearch, and you probably know that we're experts in the field of legal technology. We provide services for everything to do with estate administration, court of protection, all those kind of things, and anything to do with managing the estate and court of protection orders when looking at a vulnerable person. And so where we come from is that a lot of the products that we develop, or most of them, actually come from client feedback. So we've worked with solicitors for a number of years now in the field, and they tell us that actually the ideal scenario of what happens when you have shares in an estate to deal with is very different from the actual reality. So as always, we start with hearing about problems and we have a look at what we can do to solve those to meet client needs. So that's really where we're coming from today, is that this could be a very, very tricky area to deal with, and we know from client feedback that there are endless problems. So we're going to look at the process. We're going to look at ideally how it should work in the real world versus what actually often happens in reality. And within that, we'll then look at sort of the different areas of dealing with shares in estates, starting with identification. So, how do you work out who holds what? Valuation, how much are the shares worth? Obviously, you've got to know that before you can sell them. And you've also got to verify them. So you're looking at how they're held. And then a big problem that solicitors come up against when looking at shares in estates is missing, lost or share certificates. What happens next? If you have got share certificates that are lost or they're missing, what can you do about it? Where can you go to find them? And then probably the sort of biggest area of complex is when you come to actually share deal and transfer the shares. So actually selling them. Let's look at the process and what some of those common problems are. And I'll aim to leave you today with some takeaways and ways that you can look at to make the process better. So if we were to have a world of utopia, this would be the ideal process. So you would find that there are shares held by the deceased, and they would be magically clearly identified from any paperwork or asset inventory. All shares would be held in existing companies and currently traded on the London Stock Exchange. That would make it very nice, straightforward and really simple. You would easily be able to identify all the shares that can be easily valued at the date of death, including any dividends due. So it would be very easy for you to work out the valuation, and then you would be able to identify any dividends that were due to the recipient. All the certificates that are held and are valid, that would be the ideal world, that you know, they're held and they're valid in that holding, and actually all invalid certificates would have already been removed and destroyed. That would be a fantastic ideal scenario. When it comes to registering the grant, it would be registered with the share registrar, the holder of that those shares, and the certificates would be sent in with a dealing form signed by the personal representative, and then the shares are very easily sold and transferred. And then sort of final steps, the grant is registered with the share registrar, the certificates are sent in when dealing with the form signed by the personal representative, and then hey presto, the shares are sold and transferred. That's your job done. Really easy, straightforward process. So if we were doing a poll, and perhaps we should have done a poll actually on this webinar, I would like to hazard a guess that the vast majority of people on this call will very rarely see the process work this simply or more straightforward. There are sort of endless problems, you know, with this kind of thing. So let's have a look at what some of those problem areas are. Okay, so starting with identification of shares. So that's your sort of your first issue, isn't it, really? You know, identification of shares, company directorships, that's one thing that is really important to have a look at. You would review any company directorships records for private limited company shares, because actually there could be people that hold shares in private companies, and deceased might be one of them. So you would need to understand and you know, if that's involved in the estate. So you review those company directorship records. The other basic thing that you should be doing is asking friends, family and next of kin. So, you know, do you know if there are any share certificates lying around? Are there any lying around in the loft? You know, were you aware that the deceased held shares? Is that something that they've ever talked about? So your starting point with identifying if there are shares in the estate should come from sort of talking to family. And then you should be reviewing the deceased personal papers. So I suspect that many of you have had the situation where somebody comes in with a huge carrier bag, a box file or a filing cabinet, you know, and it's full of papers. So you're going to need to go through, you're going to need to review the deceased personal papers to see if actually anything in those papers points to the holdings of shares. The third thing that you'll want to do when identifying shares is reviewing deceased bank statements for dividend payments. So, you know, having a look through the shares, the bank statements, which obviously potentially go back years, you know, can you see any dividend payments? And it's really important that you identify those. And we've had cases where, you know, 6 months after the shares have been sold, you can find sort of £1.60 on a bank statement, and you think, well, where on earth has that come from? And actually then have to go back in the beginning and say, well, you know, where's that dividend come from? What shares does that relate to? We've obviously missed them, to go back and re-identify. So really important that you go through sort of every process that you can at this stage to identify what shares are in the estate. You don't want them coming up again after you've actually sold the shares and distributed the money from that to the beneficiaries and the executor. We talked about reviewing the company directorship records. So that is a really important one, because if you have a look through things like deceased papers and bank statements for dividends, those will give you great clues as to what's there, and asking friends and family. But as we talk about, you know, when we go through our asset search CPD, friends and family don't always know everything, and people don't keep great records, and that's why, you know, it's now routine to do an asset search on each estate. And the reviewing of company directorship records, as I mentioned before, where you're likely to turn up private limited company shares, that is done as part of the asset search. So you can see that the fifth bullet point there is conducting an asset search. So as you will already know, if you're already ordering Estatesearch services, the financial profile service that we offer, the asset search, you know, that will turn up essentially shares in the estate. And one of the things that we do as part of that asset search is that we actually query the share registrars directly in 2 cases. So 3 of the share registrars, and earlier this year, or actually the end of last year, I should say now, towards the end of last year, we actually updated our share search service, where the share registrars, we actually bought 2 of them, and we actually decided to build a technical algorithm which will go a little bit deeper into really understanding and finding share information, because the share registrars are not particularly reliable sometimes in searching their own databases. You would have found that. So the depth of the share search is actually really important as well. And as part of that asset search, that's what we do. So having now owned the data for 2 of the share registrars, we can query that in more detail, and the results that we get back are not more detailed. The 3rd registrar that we work with, they actually already respond very well and fairly accurately. They give us good data. So the share search is a really important part of that, actually. There's about £640 million actually in unclaimed share dividends in the United Kingdom. So there's a huge amount of share money missing, and a lot of it comes, you know, from not being able to identify where the shares are at this point. So those are the sort of the key things you're going to be wanting to do when you start identifying shares. You know, and as I've said, Searches UK, they already sell the asset search part of our service, so you can conduct an asset search through that, and then, you know, once you see what shareholders are there, then you can act on it. But don't overlook these sort of other aspects of it as well. So, you know, right away you can see that there's quite a bit to do to identify the shares. So let's move on then to identification and sort of a case study around that, what that looks like. So, you know, this case study is from Johnson Astelis, who are Johnson Astills, I should say, who are actually one of the solicitors that use the share services. And in this particular case, they started with a sort of big pile of personal papers, and it was really difficult to identify what shares were in these papers. What to do with them? So we can review certificates and documents that will identify what's still relevant. So you know, one of the problems with identification of shares, as we're going to go on to in a little bit more detail, is that you can't always identify what's still relevant, you know, what's still valid. You know, are some of those share certificates so old that actually they're not valid anymore? There's all sorts of other issues with identification that we're going to look at shortly in terms of sort of companies merging and all of that kind of thing. But we can review those certificates and documents, and we can help you to identify what is still relevant. The asset search, as I've just mentioned, helps because it includes the share search and the company directorship search, so you can actually find some of the information that way initially. As I mentioned just now, our updated share search now includes the majority of the FTSE 100, FTSE 250 companies. The other thing that's really interesting, and this is where this case study comes in, is that in this particular case, not only were the shares identified as part of the asset search, but they actually turned up shares belonging to not just the deceased, but the deceased's predeceased husband. Now, of course, that forms part of the estate. It is very unlikely that those shares would have ever been identified or reunited to the estate had you not done the asset search part of it to identify them. And obviously, if they're shares that belong to the predeceased, in all likelihood, those will be inherited under the will, if it's testate, by the now deceased that you're working on the case for, because they will obviously either be the beneficiary or the executor of the predeceased. So when those shares come up, they can actually be, once you identify them, they can actually be brought into the estate, and obviously that money will then pass to the subsequent beneficiaries and executors of the current deceased case. So finding predeceased shares doesn't happen all the time, but it can happen. In this particular case, it did. So Kirsty at Johnson Astil said, you know, we wouldn't have found those shares had we not done the asset search. So that's really important part of the identification, and it's great if you find some additional shares that you have to sell. So we then come on, once you've identified the fact that there are actually shares in the estate and what's there, you know, valuation. So why do you need a valuation? So as with all assets for tax purposes, of course, the HMRC require a date of death valuation for any asset in the estate, or a probate value, one of the two. And you will need a valuation to put on the IHT forms. So, but one of the biggest problems with valuing shares, of course, is that the value of shares fluctuates constantly throughout the day. And it's really difficult to know sort of what value you take. Now, some of the challenges with identifying shares values is that a lot of people will go and use sort of free resources to do that. So, and in fact, the problem with that is not only do they fluctuate throughout the day on some of those free resource databases, so the value fluctuates throughout the day. But actually, they're not actually currently commercially licensed to have that data used for a commercial basis. So in fact, one of the things that I'm really aware of, having worked at London Stock Exchange years ago, is that the redistribution licenses don't include commercial use. So for example, if you're using a Yahoo Finance or Hemscott or one of those sort of free resources, they will give you historic share prices, but they are going to vary throughout the day, and there's no actual license for that to be used commercially. So I would say, if there's no inheritance tax involved in the estate, you might be comfortable using that as a source to value the shares, but I would caution against that. So one of the key things that you need to think about is by using a method which is actually consistent and is actually the approved method, I guess, as part of the estate administration process for valuing shares. Most of you will be familiar with it. It's called the quarter up method, and that's how we calculate the probate value. So you take the value a quarter of the way up between the lowest and the highest values of the day. So you take the daily high, the daily low, the open and close. So here we've got Willy Wonka Holdings, and it's the low plus the high minus the low and the quarter. So that equals the probate value. So that's how we do it. And that is basically the sort of approved and consistently used method for valuing shares. One of the things about doing it through a proper source, if you like, or a more trustworthy source. Trustworthy is probably not the right word. The free resources are trustworthy, but they do have a variation on the price throughout the day. And if you do go in and use some of those resources, as I said, you can't rely on them properly for commercial use. But the problem is you may have some comeback if the valuation is wrong. So it's really important, if you've got the valuation wrong, you can come back and there could be quite a difference between them. You don't want that coming back on you. So it's really important that you use the quarter up method. And being used for commercial selling and buying shares is actually really important. So when we value shares, we use the quarter up method, and we actually have a commercial license, so it covers you the whole way through for that process, so you know that the valuation is accurate. I mentioned some of the challenges just now. So the free resources, Yahoo Finance, Hargreaves Lansdown, I mentioned Hemscott as well. They get a data feed from the London Stock Exchange, and they get daily historic prices. So they'll get the highs, they get the lows, but they will vary throughout the day. The terms and conditions I've mentioned are free online sources. They don't allow for redistribution, and that is because the licenses that they buy from the London Stock Exchange are expensive to receive the data in the first place, but it doesn't allow for reselling. And actually, funnily enough, one of the reasons I know that is because a very long time ago, I actually used to account manage some of these people, Yahoo Finance being one of them, Hemscott back in the day, and I would put in the distribution licenses for exactly this kind of data, for market data. The redistribution license is very expensive, and so they don't actually allow for redistribution because they don't take that kind of license, and it can't be exploited for commercial use. So do be careful how you use it. There is a sort of a strong caveat from us on that. Make sure you use the quarter up method. The other issue with valuation that we see a lot and clients tell us about is identifying dividends. So a company will announce a dividend, but the payment for that dividend is not issued until a few weeks later. Once they've announced a dividend, those shares are marked as ex-dividend or XD. Now, once a dividend payment is announced, the owner of the share at that time owns the dividend. So, for example, if the dividend announcement had been made and the deceased died the next day, it still forms part of the estate. So it's really important that you identify dividends. And obviously you're going to be looking, as I said, through bank statements to see if there's any dividend payments. But you have to be really quite forensic about that as well. And make sure that they are captured. Like I said, we've had situations where sort of 6 months later on the bank statement, you find a dividend for sort of £1.50, and you think, well, where's, what shares does that come from? So, start with the identification of the shares, but then make sure that in the important part where you are valuing, that you're looking at identifying the dividends and the ex-dividend values as well. And the value of that at the time of the dividend announcement then belongs to the beneficiary of those shares. If required, one of the services that we can offer, which we'll talk more about at the end when we talk about how you can order these services through Searches UK, is we can produce a schedule of dividends for a specific tax year or period if that is actually helpful to you. To give you a bit of an example on that, we actually did some share valuation when we started running the service, and the service is actually run at our end by our securities manager, Sean Flanagan, who's been in the business for years. Some of you may have come across her. What Sean doesn't know about shares, valuing them, identifying them, selling them, finding the certificates, you couldn't make up. So we did a bit of share selling and valuation, or share valuation I should say, to start with when we were launching the service, and we actually compared some of the valuations of shares using the core truck method which we use, and then taking some of the values of some of those free online providers, and there was actually quite a wild differentiation between quite a lot of them, and we were quite surprised at the difference. So just a sort of a little bit of caution there. The other issue is that some shares are not just traded on the London Stock Exchange, but they are actually traded on online platforms, so you don't actually know what some of the values are from those trades as well. So that is valuation challenges. Why do you need to verify shares? So when you come onto the verification, you know, why is it important to verify what you've actually got there in the estate? So well, you've got to verify the holdings in order to confirm, number one, who holds them. So are they held individually or jointly? And is that still a valid holding? So one of the biggest challenges that we see and clients report to us is that companies, particularly in this day and age, if you think about all the mergers that have gone on, companies have delisted, they've merged, or they've been acquired. So, you know, what has happened to the shares that are held in those companies? You know, if a company's merged, for example, what does that shareholding look like now? Is it held between the two companies, the original one and the new one? Has the person unaware of the, you know, have they been unaware of being issued shares in the new part of the company? They might be there. So in terms of delisting as well, companies are often delisted, and you might find old share certificates for companies that are no longer listed and no longer valid. And similarly, companies have actually been acquired rather than just merged. So if they've been taken over, have those shares been reissued in a company's name, the new company's name? You know, what is the situation? And that can often be a very difficult part of the process. So you know, the validity of the holding is an important one to establish right at the start as well. How many are held? So how many shares are we actually talking about here? And how are they held? So increasingly, we're now in a situation where a lot of shares are held electronically. And many brokers will not touch shares that are held electronically, so they don't even have a certificated form. If they're held electronically, they will need to be dealt with through, you know, the database that's holding them. You know, are they certificated? So you take, for example, Tesco as an example. We had a huge share scheme. They actually cancelled a lot of their share certificates and reissued them under new certificate identity numbers. So you need to be really careful that if somebody comes to you, you know, with a box of stuff, or there's a share certificate that's really old, it's got a particular certificate number on, you know, is that still valid? What's actually happened to it? Has it been reissued? Electronically held. And then again, if it's a company nominee with the shares, you have to establish, you know, who the nominated party is, and make sure that you're dealing correctly with that in terms of who the nominee is. So mergers I've mentioned, you know, how are they now held in merged forms, merged firms? That's really important. It's probably one of the biggest issues that come up actually is, you know, classically a company has merged and nobody knows how those shares are still held. So that's a sort of one that I think we find quite a lot now because of the age of some of the people that are passing away and the age of the shareholdings that they had. So for example, my husband had shares in Eurotunnel. We know what happened there. So his parents had bought him some shares, or his grandparents had bought him some shares in Eurotunnel. Very complicated to work out what's there and what's not still there. They don't have any value at all. How many are held, we've looked at. Which certificates are valid? We've touched on, you know, it's really important that you're not working with invalid certificates, and it can be a nightmare to work out what's still valid. Certificates for shares still need to be validated to confirm which are still valid, or if they've been reissued, or are they due to be reissued. And if there's any certificates that are missing, they need to be identified as well. easier said than done. So again, one of the pitfalls of identifying shares and verifying them is making sure that you know where any of the listing certificates are. So verification challenges, we touched on some of this. Like I said, companies are often delisted. British Gas, another good example, Centrica, National Grid. It's really hard to know how many shares are held when you are looking at old or reissued certificates or invalid certificates. So it's really important that you do the investigation really well at this point as well. The other thing that's key is how many of those shares were held at the date of death and how many are held now. And the number can differ if dividends were reinvested, for example. So you've got the ex-dividend that we talked about, the value, and once the dividend announcement's been made, those dividends belong to the deceased and in the estate. But you also need to look at the number of shares that were held if some of those dividends were reinvested. And if you don't know about the dividends in the first place, you can't always know if they're reinvested. So that's an area that you need to look at carefully as well. Alternatively, shares might be held electronically or under a company name, as I've said. So, make sure, company nominees, so make sure you have identified those properly. So we've talked about those things. This information will go out on the slides to you. So you've got all of them kind of detailed there in front of you in terms of some of the verification challenges, things to be aware of. Just to give you an idea of the complexities around verification, we've put up a case study here. Of what happened when a client brought us into a matter where we were provided with 10 shareholdings for valuation. So it just goes to show actually you can start with 10 holdings and actually what you end up with once sort of the detail falls out of it, once you've investigated properly. So of that 10 holdings, when we did the research, we found that 6 were actually overseas companies and holdings, 2 of which had then gone into liquidation and been delisted at the date of death, and 1 was no longer valid following the cash acquisition of the PLC company involved. So not straightforward at all. So once you have gone through those processes, so you've identified the shares, you have gone through the valuation, you've identified any dividends, you have verified the shares that you've got, and you have looked at how the holdings are held, so whether they're held electronically and so on, your next stage is to get the grant. So finally, you're at the point where you get the grant. So that's the process to that point. So where you've got these issues that have cropped up, so let's say you found that you've got missing share certificates when you've gone to sort of verify what shares are there, what can you do about that? So it's advisable to obtain missing certificates after the grant has been obtained, because otherwise you'll pay unnecessary indemnity if those certificates were subsequently reissued. Okay, so get the grant first and then go after the missing certificates. So rule of thumb, if the share value was less than 50,000, the registrar will usually issue a letter of indemnity and they will replace the missing certificates for a small fee, usually. If the share value is more than 50,000, the registrar will require a counter signature on the letter of indemnity, which can be obtained by a suitable insurer. So that's something you need to be aware of as well. Replacing missing certificates really incurs a huge amount of cost and time, so it's important to be really confident which certificates are missing before you proceed. So this is often an area where people become really unstuck. So one of the services that we offer as well now through our share services it is to help you find missing certificates. So that can be a really difficult situation to be in. You come to the share dealing, the transfers bit. So some of the challenges around share dealing and transfers. So once you've done the identification, you valued the shares, you verified them, you confirmed any missing share certificates that are in hand that can be sold or transferred, and you've gone in for the grant. The grant needs to be submitted to all the relevant registrars to register the death, if you haven't done that already. For non-taxable estates where the share value is less than 5,000, you can sell the shares without obtaining the grant, very similar to the threshold in probate. All relevant application forms and sales forms need to be completed though, and they need to be signed by the personal representative and submitted to whoever is going to sell the shares for you, your chosen broker, us, along with original share certificates. So that's all got to be in the process there. And then the funds from the shares will be paid to the nominated account minus any brokerage fees that you might be paying. Shares that are sold at a greater value than at the date of death are subject to tax. So if the values increase, and if shares are sold at less than the date of death value, they're tax deductible. So that's the key there. So challenges that come out of dealing and transfers, many challenges arise at this point as well, particularly where you've got multiple registrars involved. If shares are held with multiple registrars, you will require sight of the original, they will each require sight of the original grant. So if you have got multiple registrars involved, you know, you've got shares issued to different ones, that can be a really complicated part of the process. So they will need to see the grant. You know, the grant will need to be issued in different areas. There'll be different paperwork that needs to be filled in. It can be quite complex. If missing share certificates need replacing, you'll need to correspond with those individual registrars to get hold of them. So it's another kind of area where a lot of time gets spent, and it's very admin heavy. If you've got the electronic shareholdings, which, as I said, often lots of brokers won't even deal with, the decertified shares and any company nominees, they will also require, if there's multiple registrars, they will each require sight of the original grant. And again, you know, any share certificates that need replacing, you need to correspond individually with each one. Reissuing dividends, it's really important to ask for unclaimed dividends to be reissued, but you will have to remember to ask. So, as I said, if the dividend announcement's been made, the person dies the next day, they're still the owner of that dividend. But if they've been unclaimed, which obviously they may well have been, and that needs to be reissued, and you do have to remember to ask that question. Frequent dealing transfers, challenges we see in that area, sort of dealing and transfer time, broker limitations. Some brokerages are now placing limitations on their services, and as I said, they will not often assist in preparing paperwork, which is really frustrating, because actually preparing the paperwork is one of the most difficult parts of it. So some of these limitations include that they will not sell certificated shares. They've stopped doing that. They will place a minimum share value of £5,000 on it, so anything less than that they won't touch often. Share certificates can be reissued after death or after grant, but before sale, and that creates an additional complexity. It really does. So, you know, that's the reissued share certificate. This is a really big area where people come to us for help, because they just, you know, if they are reissued after death or after grant, it just really becomes a problem. And then overseas shares. So in our case study there, we had 10 shareholdings, and 6 of them were overseas. So, I mean, that's a whole other kind of continuing competence session. But overseas share selling, you will probably know, requires a medallion stamp guarantee, and we recommend specialist advice. If you do want to sell overseas shares, we can recommend, but it is a whole different ballgame, and so that's an area which we would probably need to advise on. So what to do with the proceeds of the acquisition? So other challenges often that come up in this area, we found to be that, you know, clients were aware that the deceased held shares in Dairy Crest. Dairy Crest was acquired by Saputo, and the registrar was changed. Saputo was then privately acquired, and the holdings of that were bought for cash. The clients contacted the registrar, and they would not or could not identify and confirm the holdings. So really complicated scenario there, which has come about through acquisition, and then the buying of those holdings for cash. So particular sort of circumstances that made it tricky. At Estatesearch, you know, our share specialists use contacts and persistence to help verify the holding, and they reunited the estate for £24,000. So if there is a sort of a tricky scenario, like the proceeds of acquisition, something that kind of comes out in the woodwork, kind of throws a spanner in the works, again, that's something through Searches UK, you can send us in an inquiry to look at, and we will help you with that as well. A couple of other things to think about. So Irish securities, both Bank of Ireland and Allied Irish Bank are fairly common holdings, and they're administered by Computershare in Ireland. But following Brexit, Computershare Ireland will not deal with those shares, and there is no UK broker that can access shares to settle the trade. So that is a particular challenge. Low value shares as well. If you've got very low value shares, we recommend gifting them. So if it's, you know, very little, in the estate in terms of the shares, we do recommend gifting to ShareGift, and the URL is there, sharegift.org, for you to take away and have a look at. So in summary, the process. So while it's simple in theory, and we have our kind of utopian process at the beginning, actually administering UK shares can often be very time consuming and a very protracted process, and it will throw up lots of little anomalies and areas that can be very difficult to, very frustrating to deal with in and of themselves. Identification can be difficult, and registrars are not always forthcoming for the various reasons we've covered. Valuation should always be using the core trap method. So share valued on date of death using the core trap method, and using sort of free online services as well, is something that we would sort of caveat against. So, you know, you can use the free online services, but actually, you know, they're not covered for commercial use, and they should really only be used as a guide. So if you use the core trap method, then you will actually get a far better accurate, you know, analysis of the valuation. One thing that I haven't mentioned actually is obviously weekends. Death does not observe weekends, so if somebody dies at the weekend, you know, what do you do about the valuation of the shares? Well, there is a process and a formula, I think it's in the slides we're going to be sending out, where actually you take a sort of an average between the low and the high trade across that period, and then use the core trap method. I think that is basically the process that you have to follow, because obviously, you know, market shut on a Friday at 4 o'clock, and they reopen again at 8:30 on a Monday morning, so trading costs the weekend. So again, if you've got sort of somebody that dies at the weekend, that can be tricky. But if you use this core trap method and you take the average between the low and high trades, last low, last high, and then the current low and the current high on Monday, for example, then you will get the right sort of valuation in there as well. So on to verification. As we said, it's important to confirm any identified shares are valid. You've got to understand the number of shares and the status of those certificates. Remember the threshold, the £50,000 threshold for missing and lost share certificates, and what you need to do with that. And then obviously with share dealing and share transfers, you know, think about who you're going to use to do that. Think about some of the limitations from brokers. So that sort of brings us on to the summary of services we can offer you via Searches UK. Now, the portal that we operate through them, so you have a direct link into that. You can order all of our services on there, including the asset searches, which will help you find some of the shares in the first place. You can actually now order the share valuations through the portal. So the valuations are £6 plus VAT. And that's for UK and international probate valuations. So you would just log into your Searches UK Estatesearch portal, and you would pick share valuation in your case, set up your case, pick a share valuation, and then you would put in the details of the share valuation that will come through to our department that manages that, to Sian and her team. And they will then go off and value those shares for you. It's £6 plus VAT. Now, the other services that we have here are available now. As Samantha has a product card, she will send around onto the webinar for you all. We are slowly building those into the portal, but currently it's only the valuations that are orderable through the portal. The rest of them you can order directly by email to Sam Manning. That will come through to us, and then we will be able to feed back the results of those services for you, and actually do the things that you've asked us to do. But the prices for those things are here. So we've already talked about the asset search, which you will already know if you're using it already, is £155 plus VAT. We can do a document review for price on asking. So quite literally, we have had clients send us a huge bundle of papers of share certificates and say, please just sort this out. Could you please review the documents? We'll do that for you as well. Valuation, I've talked about probate valuation, £6 plus VAT. We can do a schedule of dividends for you, mentioned earlier. So if you want to see the schedule of dividends for that last tax year or previous tax year, that's £6 plus VAT per dividend. Share verification. For each UK share verification, we charge £6 plus VAT. And the prices are per holding, and there is no minimum fee. So that's a great thing. You've got flexibility on that. Missing and lost share certificates we can find for £30 plus VAT plus the registrar fee. Share dealing and share transfers is £40 plus VAT plus the brokerage fees, and that includes the registration of the grant, verification of the holdings, and the reissue of the dividends. And we've got some comparisons there with some of the other brokers who might sell for you, and some of the share registrars there. Computershare, Equiniti and Link, their brokerage fees compared to ours, which you can see are very competitive, and our minimum fee is the same as Computershares but less than Equiniti and Link. So overall cheaper, which is the way we intended it to be. Again, prices are per holding and subject to no minimum fee. So that's it, thank you. I hope you weren't too distracted by some of the noise outside. It's a little distracting for me, but there's a lot of rich content and information in that webinar. The slides will go out, Sam will send those out, and she'll also send out the product card. I am not the shares expert in the company, Sian Flanagan is, so I have a sort of a basic overall knowledge of it, as the rest of us do, and I've brought you as much content and information in the webinar site as I can for you to take away. If you do want to order any of the share searches we talked about, your way to do that is to email Sam at the email address there, or to contact her on that phone number. But I'll hand back to Sam now, and if you do have any questions, I'll try to answer them. If I can't, then we can direct them through to Sam, and we'll get them to Sian Flanagan, our shares expert, and we will come back to you on those answers. So I hope that's been helpful, and there's lots for you to take away there and share with your colleagues. So many thanks, and over to you, Sam.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emma. Thank you so much. So as Emma has just said, if you do have any questions, do send me an email. My email address is on the screen at the moment. We'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Obviously, if myself or Emma can't answer those questions, we'll get Emma's colleague to kindly answer those for us. We haven't got any live questions at the moment, Emma, just to let you know. But what I'd like to say is thank you so much, Emma, for hosting today's session. Don't panic about the background noise. We didn't hear anything. And we would like to thank all our attendees.
Builders on piles of scaffolding out my window.
Bless you. Thank you all, everyone, as attendees, for joining us today. We know you're incredibly busy, so we do appreciate taking the time out of your day to spend with us. As Emma has said, recording will be sent out to you. A leaflet, a brochure regarding the shares information will also be sent to you. But for now, all that's left for me to say is thank you all so much for attending, and have a lovely day.
Thanks for having me. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Emma. Take care. Bye.
Bye.